They had been taught that capture was a betrayal of the revolution, a fate worse than death. But when 50 North Vietnamese women stepped off the rumbling transport trucks at a U.S. processing center near Bien Hoa in 1968, they expected American soldiers to mock their failure. They expected their own NVA political officers, also prisoners, to command their silence and enforce discipline. Instead, something impossible happened. When one of their own officers raised his fist to enforce that obedience, an American guard stepped between them. The women froze, weeping not from pain, but from sheer, destabilizing confusion. For the first time, the enemy, the barbarians from their propaganda, became their protectors. Nothing in their indoctrination had prepared them for that. The humid lowland heat of Bien Hoa hit them like a physical blow. After weeks moving through the jungle, then days in cramped, stifling transports, they finally arrived at a compound surrounded by high fences. The landscape was a foreign world, flat, packed earth, and endless razor wire. The constant thrum of helicopters vibrated in the air. There were no deep jungles, no mountain sanctuaries, just dust and the smell of diesel fuel. The women wore tattered black pajamas or faded NVA fatigues, some torn from the journey. Most were young, between 18 and 30. They had been nurses, radio operators, and intelligence liaisons working for the North Vietnamese military. When the Tet Offensive collapsed in their sector, they found themselves prisoners, not martyrs. As the trucks rolled through the gates, the barbed wire glinted, guard towers stood at the corners, and long, prefabricated barracks stretched in rows. American soldiers watched them arrive, rifles slung over their shoulders. Some looked curious. Others looked exhausted by the heat. None looked like the cruel monsters they had been warned about, which confused the women more than anything. The air smelled different here, thick with humidity and engine exhaust, nothing like the clean, damp air of the highlands. As they climbed down from the trucks, their legs wobbled. The packed earth beneath their thin sandals felt strange and solid after the jolting ride. American voices rang out, giving orders in English. The sounds were harsh and unfamiliar, completely alien. A few of the women, like Lian, understood some French, a relic of colonial rule, but this new language was just noise. They stood in tight groups, shoulder to shoulder, drawing comfort from being close. Then they saw them, the NVA political officers. 4 men stood near a separate building, also prisoners, but wearing what remained of their uniforms with stiff, defiant pride. The women's hearts sank. Even here, even in captivity, the party hierarchy remained. The commissars' faces were hard as stone. One of them, a cadre leader with cold eyes, scanned the women with contempt. The women knew that look. It meant obedience. It meant silence. It meant shame if they failed. Lian, a 23-year-old who had worked as a radio operator near Khe Sanh, felt her throat tighten. She whispered to the woman next to her, "They are here. The commissars are watching us. Then we must not bring dishonor to the revolution." The other woman replied, her voice barely audible. Around them, whispers spread like dry leaves. "Stand straight. Do not cry. Remember who we are." They had been taught since childhood that capture was the ultimate failure. A true soldier of the revolution, they were told, fought to the last breath or took their own life before surrendering to the capitalists. But the battle had ended so suddenly, their position overrun, and now they were here, alive but disgraced. An American officer approached, holding a clipboard. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a tired face. He spoke slowly. A South Vietnamese or Arvan soldier stood beside him, translating everything into their language. "You will be safe here. You will be fed and given shelter. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Safe? The word felt foreign. A lie. They had been told Americans were demons who showed no mercy, yet here was this man speaking gently, promising safety. But then the NVA cadre leader stepped forward, his voice cut through the air like shrapnel. "You will maintain discipline. You will obey. You will not embarrass our cause further." The women's heads dropped immediately. Yes, they understood. They were prisoners, but they were still NVA. They still had to obey. Even if everything else had fallen apart, that remained. The American guards directed the women toward a long wooden building. Inside, it was slightly cooler, with large fans spinning slowly on the ceiling. The women were told to line up. One by one, they would be checked by doctors, given clean clothes, and assigned to temporary barracks. Lian's heart pounded. She had heard stories, terrible, graphic stories from the political officers about what happened to captured women. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were animals who humiliated and violated their prisoners. She clenched her fists, bracing for the inevitable. When her turn came, she entered a small, screened-off area. An American Army nurse stood there, a woman with blonde hair and a tired, professional face. She smiled. Lian froze. Why was she smiling? Through the ARVN translator, the nurse spoke. "I'm going to check your health. Just basic things. Temperature, listening to your lungs, any injuries. Is that okay? Is that okay?" No one had ever asked Lian if something was okay. In the NVA, you obeyed. You didn't get asked. She nodded, unsure what else to do. The nurse was gentle. She checked Lian's pulse, looked at her eyes, asked if she had any pain. When she noticed the fading, yellow-green bruises on Lian's upper arm, marks from when her own commissar had grabbed her roughly for a perceived hesitation during a radio relay, the nurse's smile faded. "Did someone hurt you?" she asked through the translator. Lian said nothing. How could she explain? In her world, that was just discipline. That was normal. The nurse wrote something on her chart, then handed Lian a bundle of clothes. Simple, dark green fatigues, undergarments, and a pair of rubber sandals. "These are for you. You can change in the next room. Take your time." Take your time. Another strange phrase. Lian had only ever been told to hurry, to be efficient, to never waste a second for the cause. Outside, the other women went through similar experiences. Most were silent, moving like automatons, doing exactly what they were told. But inside, confusion swirled. The Americans were not cruel. They were not rough. They asked questions instead of giving orders. It made no sense. After processing, the women were led to a mess hall. Long metal tables filled the room, and the smell of food, real food, hit them immediately. For months, they had survived on manioc, thin rice gruel, and whatever plants they could forage in the jungle. They had watched their portions shrink as American bombing shattered their supply lines. Many had lost weight, their black pajamas hanging loose on thin frames. Now they saw tables covered with trays. There was rice, yes, but also pho, a rich beef broth, along with bread, vegetables, and canned fruit. Pitchers of water and hot tea stood at each table. The sight was overwhelming. An American cook, a large, weary-looking man, gestured for them to take trays. "Help yourselves," he said, the words translated by the ARVN soldier. "Eat as much as you want." The women looked at each other, uncertain. Was this a test? Were they supposed to refuse to show revolutionary discipline, or were they really allowed to eat? Slowly, one woman stepped forward, then another. Soon they formed a line, taking trays with trembling hands. When Lian received her tray, heavy with a steaming bowl of soup and a portion of bread, she nearly dropped it. The weight alone shocked her. This was more than she had eaten in a week. They sat in silence, as they had been trained to do. No talking during meals, no wasting food, no showing emotion. Lian picked up her spoon. They had been given real utensils, not just chopsticks carved from bamboo, and took a small sip of the broth. It was hot, seasoned, and rich with meat. Her eyes watered. Around her, other women reacted the same way. Some cried quietly into their bowls. Others ate mechanically, as if afraid the plates would be taken away. One older woman who had been a field nurse whispered a quiet prayer. But then came footsteps, heavy boots on the concrete floor. The NVA political officers entered the mess hall. The women immediately stiffened. Spoons paused midair, heads bowed lower. The commissar with the cold eyes walked between the tables, his face a mask of disgust. He spoke in harsh, northern-accented Vietnamese. "You eat their food and forget your honor? You accept comfort from the imperialist enemy? Have you no shame?" The room fell completely silent. Several women set down their spoons. Their appetites vanished. Guilt crashed over them. He was right, wasn't he? They were eating the enemy's food. They were accepting kindness. They were prisoners, disgraced, and now they were betraying their cause further by not resisting. Lian felt tears slide down her cheeks, not from joy at the food, but from shame. Her throat tightened. She couldn't swallow. That night, the women were taken to their barracks. Long, metal-roofed buildings with rows of simple cots. Each cot had a thin mattress, a pillow, and a light blanket. After sleeping on the hard, damp ground of the jungle, on crowded trucks, on anything they could find, the sight of individual beds felt like a dream.
But the NVA officers were housed in a nearby building, and their angry voices carried in the humid night air. The women lay on their cots, exhausted but unable to sleep. Through the thin walls, they heard the commissars arguing, discussing the disgrace of surrender, the weakness of accepting capitalist charity. One voice rose above the others, the cold-eyed cadre leader. Tomorrow, we will make sure they understand. They may be prisoners, but they are still soldiers of the revolution. They will maintain honor, or they will be reminded of their duty. The threat hung in the air. The women knew what reminded meant. It meant public criticism sessions, forced confessions, punishment. It meant being pulled aside and berated, or worse. Even in captivity, the hierarchy held. The commissars still had power over them, not through official authority, but through ideology, through shame, through the weight of everything they had been taught since birth. Lien stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the perimeter lights move across the metal beams. Her stomach was full for the first time in months. She was clean. They had been allowed to shower with real soap and lukewarm water. She was lying on a soft cot, and yet she had never felt more conflicted. "Are you awake?" whispered the woman in the next cot. Her name was Mai, a former nurse from Hanoi. "Yes," Lien whispered back. Do you think we are betraying our comrades by being here?" Lien didn't answer right away. How could she? Everything she believed was being challenged. The Americans were supposed to be monsters, but they had been correct, professional. The commissars were supposed to protect their revolutionary spirit, but they made them feel ashamed for surviving. "I don't know," Lien finally said. "I don't know anything anymore." Mai was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The American nurse gave me medicine today for the dysentery I've had for weeks. No one in our unit had medicine to give me, but the enemy did." The simple truth of that statement settled over them. The enemy had medicine. The enemy had food. The enemy had asked if they were okay, and their own commanders only offered shame.
The days began to follow a rhythm. Every morning at 6 a.m., a bell rang. The women woke, folded their blankets with military precision, and lined up outside the barracks. An American guard would do a quick count, then lead them to the mess hall for breakfast. Breakfast was always generous: rice, pho, or sometimes eggs, with bread and hot tea. The women slowly got used to eating real, substantial meals. Their bodies responded. After weeks of being weak and ravaged by jungle maladies, they started to feel stronger. Their skin cleared. The gaunt, haunted look in their eyes began to fade. After breakfast, they were given work assignments. The Americans needed help with various tasks around the processing center: laundry, kitchen work, mending uniforms, or cleaning the infirmary. The work was not hard. No one yelled at them. No one hit them for small mistakes. The American supervisors, mostly GIs just trying to get through their day, spoke firmly but fairly. If someone didn't understand an order passed through the ARVN translator, they would demonstrate it again, slowly. Lien was assigned to help in the infirmary because of her intelligence and calm demeanor. She worked alongside American medics and nurses, translating when other North Vietnamese prisoners needed medical care. She watched how the medics treated patients, even VC suspects brought in from the field, with a detached, professional efficiency, stabilizing them before interrogation. This was so different from her field hospital, where revolutionary fervor was prized, but basic supplies like antibiotics were non-existent. The routine was simple, predictable, almost peaceful, and that made the guilt worse. Because while the women ate 3 meals a day and slept on cots, they knew what was happening back home. They couldn't get letters, but news of the war was everywhere. They heard the B-52s flying high overhead on their way to bombing runs. They heard new prisoners talking about the devastation in the north. They knew their families were suffering, their comrades were dying, and here they were, prisoners of war, living better than they had lived in months. The NVA commanders noticed the change. They noticed the women gaining weight, looking healthier, and they did not approve. One afternoon, as the women returned from work, the cold-eyed commissar gathered them in the yard. American guards watched from a distance, but didn't interfere. The commissars were prisoners too, and they had the right to speak to their countrywomen. The commissar's voice was cold and sharp. "Look at yourselves. You grow fat on imperialist food while your families starve under their bombs. You smile at American soldiers while our brothers die in the jungle. You have forgotten who you are." The words cut deep. The women stood frozen, heads bowed, unable to defend themselves, because part of what he said felt true. They were eating well. They were accepting basic decency from the enemy, and every moment of relative comfort felt like a betrayal.
"You will remember your place," the commissar continued, his voice dropping to a menacing quiet. "You will stop fraternizing with the Americans. You will maintain revolutionary dignity, or I will ensure you understand the meaning of shame." After he dismissed them, the women walked to their barracks in silence. The small relief they had started to feel, the simple physical comfort of being safe and fed, evaporated. They were back in the familiar cage of ideological obligation and fear, even if the bars were invisible. But the Americans noticed the change. Sergeant Miller, a tall, quiet man who supervised the camp's logistics, saw how quiet the women had become after the commissar's speech. He had been in country for 11 months and had seen enough to recognize the look of deep, abiding fear. He saw the way their eyes darted to the NVA officers' building. One day he approached Lynn as she worked in the infirmary. "Is everything okay?" he asked, speaking slowly, relying on her basic understanding of French, which he also spoke passably. "You seem different, scared." Lynn didn't know how to answer. How could she explain the complex web of duty, indoctrination, and fear that governed her life? How could she make him understand that her own comrades were more frightening than her captors? "It is difficult," she said in French, looking down. Miller wasn't fooled. He'd seen fear in the eyes of new GIs and South Vietnamese soldiers. He didn't like seeing it in someone who should have been safe under his watch. Other American soldiers noticed too. Private Johnson, a young draftee working in the laundry, saw how the women flinched when the NVA officers walked by during their own work details. He saw how they stopped talking the moment a commissar appeared. He mentioned it to Miller. "Something's not right, Sarge. Those women are terrified of their own guys." Miller nodded. "I've seen it. Keep an eye out. We're responsible for them." Meanwhile, small, awkward kindnesses continued. A GI named Thompson, guarding the mess hall, watched the women hesitate to take second helpings, even though they were clearly still hungry. He'd push a tray of bread closer. "Go on," he'd mutter. "Eat." Another guard, seeing a younger woman crying quietly after the commissar's speech, tossed her a pack of C-ration cigarettes, not as a flirtation, but as a clumsy gesture of comfort. These moments of connection confused the women even more. The Americans treated them like people, but every time they started to relax, the commissar's voices would echo in their minds. "You are disgracing your cause. You have forgotten your honor." They were caught between two worlds, and both felt like a betrayal. Lean kept her thoughts hidden, locked away. At night, when everyone else was asleep, she would lie on her cot and stare into the darkness, her mind racing. She wrote nothing down. That was a bourgeois indulgence and dangerous, but she replayed events in her mind. One entry in this mental diary read, "I don't know who I am anymore. For 23 years I knew exactly who I was, a soldier of the revolution, an obedient member of the collective, a faithful servant of Uncle Ho. Now I am a prisoner. The enemy treats me with a professional decency that feels confusing. They ask me if I'm okay. They give me medicine when I'm sick, and I feel guilty for being grateful. Is this a betrayal? Is this the sentimental weakness the commissars warned us about?" Another entry, a week later, "Today Sergeant Miller asked me, in his broken French, about my village. He wanted to know if we grew rice. When I told him, he showed me a picture of his family's farm in a place called Ohio. He misses his home. He worries about his family. In that moment, I saw him not as an imperialist aggressor, but as a farmer. And I realized he probably sees me as someone's daughter too, not as an enemy, just as a person. This thought terrifies me because it changes everything." She was not alone in her confusion. Late at night, after lights out, whispered conversations filled the barracks, barely audible over the sound of insects and distant artillery. "Do you think we're wrong to eat their food? What choice do we have?" Another responded. "Starve to show our loyalty? But the commissars say we're betraying the struggle." "The commissars wanted us to fight until we were dead," Mai whispered sharply. "Are they really the ones we should listen to?" This last comment was met with sharp gasps. To question a political officer was unthinkable, but slowly,
quietly. The women were starting to think the unthinkable. Yuki voiced what many felt. "I've been thinking about something. The Americans didn't have to give us the same food as their ARVN allies. They didn't have to give us medicine or clean cots. The rules of war say humane treatment, but they could do the bare minimum. Instead, they do more. Why?" No one had an answer, but the question stayed with them, eating away at the certainties they had lived by. And the tension was building. Everyone could feel it. The commissars were getting angrier. The women were getting more confused. And the Americans were starting to watch more carefully. The breaking point came on a humid, sweltering afternoon in late September. The women were returning from their work assignments, tired but in relatively calm spirits. One of the newer women, a girl named Trang, who couldn't have been more than 18, had been assigned to the kitchen. An American cook, the same one from the first day, had given her an extra piece of bread and a small, foil-wrapped square of chocolate from a ration pack. Trang was humming, a quiet, tuneless sound of simple relief. The NVA commissar appeared from nowhere. His face was dark with rage. He had seen the small, clumsy exchange. He grabbed Trang by the arm, yanking her out of the line so forcefully she fell to her knees. "You take gifts from them now? You hum their decadent tunes? You have completely forgotten your honor." Trang froze, terrified, the small piece of chocolate falling into the dust. The commissar raised his hand to strike her across the face, but before his hand could fall, an American guard stepped between them. It was Sergeant Miller. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of command. "That's enough. Step back." The commissar's eyes blazed. "This is not your concern, American. She is Vietnamese. I am her superior officer," he spat out, his French mixed with angry Vietnamese. "You're a prisoner, same as her," Miller replied, his hand resting on his belt, not threatening, but steady. "And in this camp, prisoners don't hit each other. I said, step back." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The women held their breath. The other American guards had noticed the confrontation and were approaching. The commissar was outnumbered, and he knew it. His hand dropped, but his face twisted with humiliation and rage. He spat words at Trang in Vietnamese. "You are dead to the revolution. You are not Vietnamese anymore." Then he turned and stalked away, the other officers following him. Trang knelt in the dust, trembling, tears streaming down her face. Sergeant Miller knelt to her level, his voice gentle. He looked at Lien, who had witnessed everything. "Tell her she's safe," he said in his simple French. "Tell her that won't happen again." Lien translated, her own voice shaking. When Trang heard the words, she cried harder, not from fear now, but from overwhelming, shattering confusion. The enemy had protected her from her own people. Her own commander had called her dead, but the American, the one she'd been taught to fear as a monster, had kept her safe. That night, the barracks buzzed with whispered conversations, louder and more urgent than ever before. The women couldn't stop talking about what had happened. For the first time, they spoke openly, angrily, about their doubts. "He was going to hit her," Mai whispered, her voice shaking with indignation. "Trang did nothing but accept a piece of bread, and our own commissar was going to strike her in front of the enemy. And the American stopped him," Lien said, the words still tasting strange. "The American? Why would he do that? Why would he care?" "Because maybe they don't see us as animals," another woman offered. "But we're the enemy, aren't we? The war is still happening. Our comrades are still dying." The next morning, something had changed. The women walked differently as they lined up for the count. They held their heads a little higher. When they passed the NVA commanders, they didn't bow as deeply. The fear was still there, a lifetime of conditioning, but something else was there too, a quiet defiance, a small, fragile spark of independence. The Americans noticed. Captain Richards, the young, tired-faced camp commander, called Sergeant Miller into his makeshift office. "The situation with the NVA officers is getting worse," Richard said, rubbing his eyes. "They're trying to maintain ideological control over the women through intimidation. But this is a U.S. facility. Those women are POWs under our protection, not under the authority of other prisoners." "What do you want me to do, sir?" Miller asked. "Keep watching, and if any of those officers try to enforce discipline again, intervene immediately. The women need to understand that they're safe here, really safe. Not just from us, but from everyone." Miller nodded. "Some of them are starting to see it, sir, but they've been trained their whole lives to obey that authority. Breaking that conditioning, it isn't easy. I know, but we have to try, because if we don't protect them, we're no better than the propaganda they've been fed about us. The women's transformation was gradual but real. They started asking questions. Lien, in the infirmary, used her broken French to ask Miller about America. What is life like there? What about the women? Miller answered honestly. He told her about women working in factories, being nurses, even pilots. He told her women in America could vote. They could own property. They could, in many places, choose their own husbands. This information spread through the barracks like wildfire. The women discussed it endlessly. Imagine, Mai said one evening, choosing who you marry. Imagine, another added, learning a profession, not just being assigned one by the party. They weren't becoming American. They were still Vietnamese, but they were beginning to see that the way they had been taught things must be was not the only way things could be.
The commanders sensed this shift, and it enraged them. They saw their authority slipping away. They saw the women listening to American ideas. They saw what they considered the corruption of revolutionary values, and they became desperate to reassert control. The confrontation everyone had been dreading came on a cool October morning. The women were lined up for breakfast when the cold-eyed commissar and two other officers approached. The commissar carried a thin rattan cane, a symbol of authority and punishment. His voice rang out across the yard. "You have all forgotten your duty. You have become soft, accepting the enemy's charity, forgetting the struggle of your comrades. Today, you will be reminded of who you are." He pointed the cane at three women, Trang, Mai, and Lien. "You three especially. You have been seen fraternizing with the Americans, acting as if you are friends with the imperialist enemy. This will be corrected." The women's blood ran cold. They knew what corrected meant: public humiliation, physical discipline. The American guards were at the other end of the yard, but Sergeant Miller saw what was happening. He started walking quickly toward the scene. The commissar raised his cane, stepping toward Trang. "You will kneel and apologize for your dishonor." Trang's legs trembled, but she didn't move. Something in her had changed. She had been protected once. "I said, kneel!" the commissar shouted. "No," Trang whispered. Then louder, "No!" The word hung in the humid air like thunder. The other women gasped. No one said no to a commissar. The man's face turned purple with rage. He raised the cane high, preparing to strike. But before it could fall, Sergeant Miller was there, along with 4 other GIs. Miller grabbed the cane mid-swing, yanking it from the commissar's hands. "I told you," Miller said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You don't touch these women. Not now, not ever again." "They are Vietnamese. They are under my authority," the commissar screamed, switching to furious French. Captain Richards approached. He addressed the commissar directly. "You have no authority in this camp. You are a prisoner, same as them. And these women are under the protection of the United States military. If you attempt to harm them again, you will be placed in isolation. Do you understand?" The commissar looked around. He was surrounded by armed American guards. The women were watching, and for the first time he saw something new in their eyes. Not fear, not submission, defiance. He had lost. "This is a disgrace. You are all traitors to the revolution." Lien stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "We are survivors. That is not the same as traitors." The word stunned everyone. A Vietnamese woman contradicting a political officer in public, in front of Americans. It violated every cultural and ideological norm she had been raised with. The commissar stared at her with pure hatred, but his power was broken. He turned and walked away, the other officers following. His authority, built on ideological fear, had shattered against the simple physical protection offered by the enemy. Captain Richards addressed the women. "You don't have to be afraid of them anymore. You are under our protection. Anyone who tries to harm you will answer to us. You have my word." Through Lien translating, her face streaked with tears, the women heard this promise, and one by one, they began to cry. Not from fear, but from relief, from gratitude, from the overwhelming realization that they were truly safe.
The Americans had done what their own commissars never had. They had protected them. In that moment, everything they had been taught about who was good and who was evil shattered completely. In the weeks after, the NVA officers were moved. A new anxiety crept in, rumors of repatriation. The Paris Peace Accords were being discussed. Eventually, everyone would go home. But what was home? A North ravaged by bombs? And how would they be seen? As survivors? Or as traitors corrupted by the enemy? They had changed. They had seen that life could exist without constant fear. The day came. Sergeant Miller found Lynn. He handed her a small, worn French-English dictionary. "So you can keep learning," he said in French. "I hope things go well for you back home." "I don't know what we'll find," Leon admitted, "but we're different now. We learned that enemies can be human." Years later, an elderly Leon would tell her grandchildren, "I was a prisoner. I had been taught that Americans were monsters. But I learned that sometimes the enemy shows you more kindness than your own people do. True honor isn't about blind obedience to a cause. It's about treating people with dignity." The Americans taught us that. They taught us that the world is not divided into pure good and pure evil, but into those who choose compassion and those who choose cruelty. And that choice has nothing to do with which uniform you wear.